Ooh. Fantastic. Can everyone see the screen okay? Wonderful. So this is the first tiny forest that we ever planted in the UK. This is in Witney, near Oxford, and this is after 2 growing seasons. So yeah, it was planted in 2020, and this is a few months ago. So you can really see how the trees have absolutely shot up, and it really is this like amazingly dense forested area. Wonderful. So yeah, briefly the overview again. We're going to take you through what is a tiny forest. As most of you already know what one is because you look after them, that will happen quite quickly. And then a bit about where our planting method actually comes from. So how it was developed and how it's changed over time. And then we'll go through the step-by-step of following how our scientists, myself included, plan the tiny forests. And then there'll be a bit of a what next and how you can get involved. Obviously you are already quite involved, and then questions. So a little bit about myself. So I'm Eve, as it says, and I started working for Earthwatch in June last year, and my role is science coordinator, which means that I'm part of the science team, and I help to plan the tiny forests that are coming up. So I'm almost a bit of a bridge between the science team and the research that they're doing, and the project management side of things, where they actually do a lot of the tiny forest planting. So if there's a kind of science aspect in the planting, like tree species and supplements, then that is what I would be doing. But we've got an amazing team who help out with it and everything else. So a tiny forest is a dense, fast-growing miniature native woodland. So it is about the size of a tennis court, so 200 meters squared. And within that quite small area, we plant 600 trees. So they are planted incredibly close together. So it's 3 trees per meter squared. So they're roughly 30 centimeters away from each other, which is very different from normal, like traditional planting, where you might have a load of trees kind of like a meter or so apart in like a nice neat little row. Now what we do is we plant them all very close together. We completely mix all the tree types in as well, and this creates that incredibly dense woodland area. And this method was developed by the Chinese botanist Dr. Miyawaki, and I'll explain a bit about that on the next slide as well. So as well as having 600 trees in this forested area, we also have between 15 and 25 tree species per forest. So we can kind of range in anything from sort of about 80 or 90 to a single tree species to just 10. So some of them we have quite a lot of tree species, but quite small amounts of each tree species. And because we've mixed them all together, so we don't have specified areas for the canopy layer or the shrub layer, there is competition across all forest layers throughout the forest. And this presents an urban nature-based solution to a variety of issues, such as people disconnect from nature, the urban heat island effect, and it does its small part towards climate change as well, because although it's not going to save the world, every tree counts. So a little bit about the Milwaukee planting method. So what we have in the UK and in the Netherlands as well, we call them tiny forests, and if they're planted by Earthwatch or in partnership with Earthwatch, then they are officially tiny forests. There are other examples of this planting method, the Milwaukee planting method, in countries all over the world. So in Japan, there's a lot of them because this is where it was developed in the 70s. There were also a large number in India as well, and I've heard of some happening in Africa and now some in the US as well. So it really is quite a global kind of phenomenon, really, what's happening here. So the principle is that you have a mix of all 4 forest layers, as shown in the picture here. So you have your little shrub layer, you then have your sort of understory subtree layer, then you have your subcanopy layer, and then finally you have your canopy trees, and the canopy trees are the big trees like the oaks and the beeches and the big lime trees. So it's a complete mix as you'd get in a natural forested area. And because of this competition that they're in, the trees grow a lot faster than they would naturally. Well, grow faster than they would in conventional planting, because they're all so close together, they're all competing, and then they have to grow quickly. And as you can see from the picture on the first slide, they really do grow up very, very quickly. And it's a very low maintenance solution. So after the first few years of planting, of weeding, to just kind of stop the small little trees from being overwhelmed, after that, they don't really need any maintenance at all. So that keeps costs down. And despite the fact that there are so many trees planted in such a dense kind of planting area, there has been low mortality reported so far, but we are still gathering data on that. So any surveys you go out and do helps towards that. So on to how we actually go about planting our tiny forest. So we have to find suitable sites first. Often these are proposed by in partnership with councils like Leicester Council, and other times funders might propose sites, or landowners we have relationships with. Either way, we have to make sure that the site is an appropriate location and an appropriate size and kind of ticks all of our boxes. So size wise, it has to be 200 metre squared, because that is the size of our tiny forests. That can be quite tight sometimes if there are a lot of other constraints, but often if it's in a park or something, then that's absolutely fine. It has to be a minimum of 4 metres wide, because if we have one which is like really long and thin, you don't get that dense kind of like micro sort of like environment space going on. Yeah, so 4 metres wide is the minimum that we'll do. Normally we want them quite a bit wider than that. We also have to consider like the current land cover and the land use. You know, is it appropriate to put a tiny forest there? And sometimes we just need to think about previous land use as well, kind of what might have been there before that could cause some issues. Like if it used to have a building there, for instance, there could be sort of like some concrete or rubble that we need to deal with. So we sort of need to look into that a little bit. Predominantly they're in urban areas, because that is the kind of areas that we want to reach, because those are the places that will benefit the most from having a tiny forest. And often this is in a park or a school. Yeah, schools really benefit a lot, because I mean the kids can go out there and in their science lessons they can measure for trees, and they love helping to plant the trees as well. But then a park's really important because that's public access, so everyone can come and enjoy it. And yeah, so once we've selected our site and figured out all of that, then we can go on to some more site checks. So what I do a lot of in my job is getting utility maps from different utility companies. So that's like a map showing where electric cables are and where like water mains are and things like that. And I use GIS software, so that's geographic information software systems, to map this. So I overlay all of them, and then I can see if any of those pipes or cables are close to the site and might be an issue, because, well, we can't plant on top of them because we don't want to dig them up, but if they're too close, then tree roots could have an issue. And we don't want kind of, you know, 5 years down the line, some very annoyed utility companies saying like, oh, you know, your tree roots have messed up our water pipe. So that's quite important to do. And we also need to check that it's not too close to any protected sites. So we don't have much of this in kind of urban areas. But if you wanted to plant, say, in a site of special scientific interest or a nature reserve, then you need to get special permissions for tree planting, because they want to kind of protect the ecology of that area. And yeah, so those are the main site checks that we do. We also had to take a quick look on desk-based assessment at some of the things like what the pH is like, what the soil type is like, but we do also look at that on site as well. So this is where we actually put boots on the ground and go and visit our sites, or we can sometimes get our partners to go and visit the sites if they're quite far away. So we go there and we do some sampling. So we use a corer like the one shown in the picture, and we use that to see what the soil is like beneath our feet. So you can see on this one, it's quite loamy on top, and then it changes to kind of very much a lighter colour. I think that was a sort of light coloured clay on that site, if I remember. But yeah, it's important to tell that because certain trees like to grow in certain conditions. So you have some which love dry, sandy sites, and some which absolutely love kind of like wet, clayey sites. So we need to find this out to find out what tree species can be planted in that area. And we also then take a sample, and this is probably one of my favourite bits. We use that soil sample to tell what nutrients are in the ground there. And so after we've taken the sample, we then use these do it yourself at home tests. If you ever wanted to test your garden or something, you can get these on Amazon. I think they're about £25 for like a pack of, you can do 10 tests with that. And they change colour. So you put the powder in and then you mix up your sample, and then it goes absolutely fantastic colours. Like this one, the nitrogen one, that was very high nitrogen, so that went bright purple. And we also do a pH test as well to see what pH, because similar to the soil characteristics, some trees really like acidic and some trees absolutely hate it, but they really like if the soil has a higher pH, if it's like a more alkaline environment. So we test for phosphorus, nitrogen and potassium with those tests. And also the site visit is good to see if there are any potential issues with the site too. So, or like access points as well, kind of where you're going to get the machinery in. For instance, one of my colleagues was in a site test in Bedfordshire earlier this week, and she went up to the site test, and I'd done all the utility mapping to see what sort of pipes and things there were there, and she got to the site and there was a manhole cover because there was like private drainage that wasn't on any of our maps, and now we've had to move the site and sort that out. But if we hadn't have done a site visit, we wouldn't have known that was an issue, and it would have become more of an issue later on when the diggers got there. So after we do that, we record all that information to then select our tree species. So each tiny forest has its own custom-made tree species list for it. These can be quite similar if two sites are very close together and they have pretty much similar characteristics. But also if you have a site, we've had some in Glasgow, they are very different tree species lists to some sites which happen in London, for instance. And so we base the tree species list on our site test information. So what soil results it was, so what soil composition it is it clay, is it sandy, is it loamy, what the pH is, we look at that, what the nutrient levels are, because some trees will not survive on if there isn't enough nutrients, but then some other ones are a bit more hardy and can survive on anything. And we also put in what the soil moisture level is as well, because again, some really like waterlogged conditions like the willows, but then some will not like that at all. And to determine what trees are like native to that area, we use a system of reference forests, which are semi-ancient natural woodlands, which have been established, which have been around for hundreds of years, and they're considered like a prime example of what the natural tree cover would be like in that specific area. So from that, we can say, okay, this site is quite close to this reference forest, which has these trees in, and our soil results say these trees would fit, and then from that we kind of compare the two and we come up with list of species which are native to that area and which would really like the soil conditions. So that's quite a lot to get your head around and try quite a lot to work out. But we've developed a tool on Excel to do this, well, to do a lot of this for us, where we put the characteristics in, and then it kind of spits out a list of trees at the end saying if this tree would be a good fit or a medium fit or a bad fit. That was actually we had a micro internship and some students came along and just, they're absolute computer whizzes and just did that. And that's fantastic, because it means that we don't have to sit there and like every single tree species every single time try and work out what conditions they'd like the most. But we still have to decide the number of each species to include. So we weight that towards, if it's in the reference forest, we'll put more species of that tree in the forest. And if it's a good fit, then it gets more species, more individuals of that tree, sorry. If it's kind of more of a medium fit, we might put a few in just to up the diversity, but we wouldn't put too many in because we don't want them to, you know, if conditions aren't right, they might not make it. And we also make sure that there's a good mix of the canopy layers, of the tree layers. So we make sure most of them are canopy. So 40 to 50% of our forests are canopy trees. So again, that's like the big trees like the oaks and the limes and things like that. Then a smaller percentage is the subcanopy and understory, and then the smallest percentage is the shrubs, because they're still very important, but we don't need quite as many of them. I think they're about between 8 to 12% of the overall forest. So again, from our decisions about, again, from our site visits, we know what the soil is made up of, if it's clayey or if it's sandy, and also what the nutrients are. And as part of our method, we add supplements to the soil to help the trees get that little extra boost when they're just starting out. And also a lot of our sites in urban areas are really quite nutrient deficient. So when we do the tests, some of them barely have any nutrients in at all, especially a lot of grasslands quite depleted. So we often add compost to make the soil more nutrient rich. So we excavate out the soil down to normally 1 metre where the site is, and then we mix all of the nutrients in, the compost in, and then put it all back again. And depending on the characteristics of the soil, if it's sort of really clayey, we often add straw to like kind of break it up a little bit so that the roots can get through easier. However, if it's, and that helps with drainage too if it's clayey, if the soils are sandy, then we add manure to it, because that helps kind of give the soil more structure and like helps with water retention, because sandy soils often, like if it rains it just goes whoop, straight through. So we kind of like to hold the water there for a bit longer so the trees can absorb a little bit more. Ooh, on to the design. This is another one of my favorite bits because it's a chance to get quite creative with it, quite like artistic. So once we've decided all of that, like quite technical stuff, we then move on to the design. And these are some of the designs we've used in the past. The Octagon one is Whitney. That was our first ever forest. So it's got the green bit is where the trees are, and then the brown bit is the classroom area. So quite a lot of our forests have classroom areas like incorporated in them. So that if it's in a school, like they can have outdoor lessons there. If it's a community area, then you can kind of use your forest how you want to use it. If you want to kind of like host a session or something there, it's nice to have like a little seating area within the forest area. And one even up in Doncaster had a pond in it. They requested a pond, and it's really cool. It's like some big tractor tires, and they've lined them. And then when we were there were like frogs and everything. You can imagine the kids were there like kind of trying to poke the frogs, but I'm sure they had places to hide. So yeah, what we do here is just make sure that it's a big enough space, so it's around about 200 meters squared, and that the classroom's big enough to be usable, and again that like it's not the narrowest point isn't less than 4 meters, because it needs that width to have the sort of little microclimate area. Woo, right, so now it's on to the really fun part, which I'm sure some of you have been involved in, which is planting the trees. So we travel out to site, and then we meet all of the people planting the trees for us. If it's I mean, we do plant a few ourselves, but predominantly it is that local community or schools. Children are very, very good at planting trees. They absolutely love it, and they turn it into a bit of a competition often, like, I've planted more trees than you, and things like that. So yeah, and it's in school grounds, it's quite good because they try and get kind of every child to plant at least 1 tree, which is 600 trees is normally like quite doable. And then the students can kind of watch their tree grow up if they can remember where it is. That's the challenge. And yeah, it's a fantastic day. As Alexander will confirm, the planting day in Dunstable, the council brought out like kind of hot fruit punch and mince pies, so that an awful lot of mince pies were consumed that day. A lot of trees planted as well, 600 trees planted in like quite freezing conditions. So yeah, if there's ever a planting sort of near where you are, like keep a lookout, and I definitely recommend going to it because it is it's a really good day, and it's good for us as well to see it all come together, because as I'm sure you've now realised from all of this, there's an awful lot of work that goes on to planning the tiny forests and making sure that the trees have the best start, making sure the design is right, because when we do the design, we also, you know, we talk to the school or the landowner and the people who are going to use it to just make sure that like that's what they want. You know, they want a classroom or they want a path to make it the best space possible for them. So yeah, it's lovely seeing that all come together, and planting trees is always really great fun as well. And so yeah, that is the end of the planting trees journey, I believe. Yeah. Have we got any questions about any of that process? I'll try and help as much as I can. There's a few messages in the chat actually I haven't seen.
I had a few questions. Just because I've been reading stuff, both Hannah Lewis's book and the Dutch handbook, and I noticed a few differences, and I'm really interested in how you arrived at your method. So the proportions of trees, the canopy trees and sub-canopy, are slightly different from the Dutch handbook. Yes. You've got more canopy trees. What's led you to do that?
If I'm honest, I don't actually know the whole answer to that. I know that we developed our method from the Dutch handbook and what IVM were doing, but I don't know why the canopy layers changed, but I can definitely find out. A lot of those decisions were made before I came along and started planning them. So yeah, so it's why.
Okay. Yeah, because there are other differences as well, like whether you plant 30 centimetres or 60 centimetres apart. Different people say differently on that one, and also whether you plant them completely randomly or whether you make some attempt to mix, because obviously random and mix are different. If you plant completely randomly, you will end up with some canopy species next to each other. So in some Miyawaki forests, I think they take a slightly more planned approach to try and make sure that things are spread more evenly rather than randomly. So I was kind of interested in how in Earthwatch you arrived at the particular way that you do it.
So with the randomness one, a large part of it is if you try and, well, we found if you try and kind of make it too structured, especially when you've got quite small children planting, it becomes chaos anyway. And kind of having a sort of free fall of planting the trees, it does actually, it on the whole creates quite a randomized output. But yeah, I do get your point. There are sometimes like trees from the same layer planted together, we do ask people to make sure when they're planting their trees that they don't plant, you know, a whole section of oaks right next to each other. But yeah, we don't tend to watch out for the canopy layers, and that is a really good point. But I think just because it is such a random nature to it, on the whole, we're okay with that. But yeah, I mean, maybe there is some scope for looking at kind of a more sort of strategic planting.
I think what they suggest, I can't remember where I got this from, that in some places what they do is divide the area into kind of sections and then allocate the right proportion of each of the 4 layers to each of those sections, so that you know you're not going to have more than 6 canopy trees in this section. So just to make sure that they're reasonably evenly distributed. I mean, even then, of course, they could end up next to each other. But when you're working on a smaller scale and you allocate the kids to that section, then it becomes a little bit easier to spread them evenly. But I was there at the planting day. I appreciate, you know, it's not, we had 120 kids. It wasn't easy. Yeah, I wouldn't have found it easy to make that happen. We do sometimes section it off and kind of have different sections for like different planting sessions, because you know how it is with the schools, they come in like their classes normally. But for a large part, that is just to make sure that not all of the people in the first session kind of get greedy and plant all the trees. And that there's a kind of even distribution of trees across the site. But yeah, rather than kind of making sure that it's the mix of layers, it's more for that kind of practicality instead. But I mean, things like Whitney, like they are really quite mixed. So yeah, definitely room for thinking about that. I'm just going to stop the recording actually, because it's on questions now. Let me figure out how to do this.